everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of At the Boundary, the podcast from the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm Jim Cardoso, Senior Director for GNSI, and your host for At the Boundary. Joining us on today's episode is the author of a recent analysis of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or more specifically, the end of that treaty. New START was the last remaining bilateral nuclear arms control agreement between the U.S. and Russia, and it expired on February 4th. We'll be talking about the article with its author, Dr. Heather Williams, in just a few moments. First, though, some final updates about GNSI Tampa Summit 6, which takes place next week. We've gathered together an outstanding group of speakers, researchers, policymakers, and practitioners for the conference, entitled Cracks in the Lamp, Freeing the Nuclear Genie. It's set for March 24th to the 25th at the Marshall Student Center here at USF. Our headline speaker group includes retired Air Force General John Hyten, former commander of U.S. Strategic Command and vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs; Franklin Miller, former special assistant to the president as well as assistant secretary of defense and senior director for the National Security Council; retired Ambassador Christopher Hill, a five-time U.S. ambassador and former assistant secretary of state; and of course, our own GNSI executive director and former commander of U.S. Central Command, retired Marine Corps General Frank McKenzie. Joining them will be a who's who of top leaders and experts in the nuclear field. Tampa Summit 6 will examine the critical issues and questions for the modern nuclear era, such as nuclear deterrence and Golden Dome, nuclear weapons on the battlefield, the future of testing and proliferation, military applications of nuclear energy, and many more. We'll have several breakout sessions during the summit, highlighted by the On the Nuclear Brink tabletop exercise run by the Project on Nuclear Issues from CSIS. At USF, we're proud to host this event, so we'll also showcase USF faculty and student research, including the public debut of the Security Analysis Innovation Lab at USF's College of Arts and Sciences. There's no cost to attend, but registration is required. You can find registration, the full agenda, and list of speakers, along with other information on our website. One other quick note. Back in 2024, GNSI research fellows Rob Burrell and Arman Mahmoudian predicted the U.S. engagements both in Venezuela and Iran. The two of them got back together recently to write a new article for the National Interest entitled, What Do Trump's Strikes in Venezuela and Iran Mean for China? In this piece, Rob and Arman examine whether the Trump administration's use of military force may shape its approach to China in years to come. We'll post a link to this insightful article in the show notes. All right, let's turn to our featured guest. Dr. Heather Williams is a director of the Project on Nuclear Issues and a senior fellow in the Defense and Security Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She recently authored an analysis for CSIS entitled 3 Truths About the End of New START and What It Means for Strategic Competition. What are those 3 truths? And what more do they say about the future of arms control? That's where we'll start our conversation today. Heather Williams, welcome to At the Boundary. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited for the conversation.
Me as well. So to open the conversation, just can you summarize the 3 truths from your article about the end of New START, and maybe provide folks who haven't read your article yet some of your thoughts on these 3 truths?
Yeah, so the main truth that I'll probably want to hammer home the hardest is that this is not necessarily the start of an arms race. If it is an arms race, America is losing. But to zoom out just a little bit, I wrote these 3 truths about arms control because it was the end of the new Strategic Arms Control Treaty, which was concluded in 2010 and then shortly thereafter entered into force. And it expired. It ended at the beginning of February. And this treaty is kind of like a legacy. It comes in it has like a rich history of other bilateral arms control agreements between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and now the U.S. and Russia, that included on-site verifications. It was a lot of on-site verifications. It included data exchanges. It often took a long time to negotiate these. These were really intrusive treaties. And when New START expired at the beginning of February, it's the end of an era. And so one of the big questions that I heard going around Washington and in the nuclear wonk crowd, so to speak, was, well, what does this all mean? And there were a lot of doom and gloom assessments saying this is going to be the start of an arms race. The guardrails are gone. The US and Russia can just build freely now. And so the first truth that I wanted to point to was that this isn't necessarily the start of a really big arms race. If it was, well, Russia has really been racing ahead for quite a while now. Since New START in 2010, Russia has built up its type of nuclear capable systems significantly. It's had a 20% increase. China has also been building up really rapidly. In non-strategic systems, Russia has increased by 25%. Now, these are systems not covered under New START, so I take the point that that's not what New START was for, but it's all to say that New START isn't necessarily going to be the thing that's going to stop Russia or even China from doing big buildups. So that was the first truth.
Yeah, I was saying that. On that first, only thing I did that first truth and hopefully people will hear this and then they'll reference the article. Another reason to reference the article is you provide 3 very basic graphs that show what you just described, but it is still stunning to look at those graphs to see, China and Russia above the line and US negative below the line. It really is striking to see that.
Thank you for that. I had to fight for those charts to look as simplistic as they do.
Oh, they were fantastic.
But we have this amazing graphics team at CSIS, and they were like, well, no, don't you want this? And don't you want that? And I was like, no, I want to tell the most basic story, which is Russia and China have been building up sometimes up to 30% increases in their arsenals. And we've been going down sometimes into like 15%, if not more. And it is like just seeing it visually like that does tell this really striking story, which is that while we, the US, have been showing a lot of restraint in our nuclear systems, we have been decreasing the number of systems that we have, the types, the different platforms. Russia and China have just been racing ahead. And so I appreciate you calling out those graphs. They're great. Were hard won, but they were worth it.
Well, I'm sure your team is fantastic, and I look forward to future graphs from them. But in this case, the simplicity, because I looked at it, I was like, wow, okay. So I would say if you're listening to this, you haven't read the article, read the article for the simple graphs. They definitely tell the story. On to the second truth. So let's press on with the conversation.
Yeah, the second truth was that if the U.S. does decide to build up, it doesn't need a massive buildup. I don't hear any serious conversation suggesting that the U.S. needs to build up its arsenal to match Russian and Chinese combined numbers of nuclear platforms. But there is a general recognition that the U.S. does need to expand and diversify its nuclear arsenal. A couple quick reasons for this. If anyone's interested in this, the best source on it is the 2023 Bipartisan Strategic Posture Commission, which really outlines the case for how much the world has changed in the past 15 years. Our plans for nuclear modernization, those were finalized in 2012. Think about how different the world is, right? Like Russia hadn't even invaded Ukraine for the first time. China's nuclear silos hadn't been discovered yet. And so the arsenal that we are building right now is an arsenal for a very different era. So what might that arsenal of the future look like? As I said, it does not have to be a massive change. It's more thinking about what are some different types of platforms that we can have, preferably things that can be theater range that will help assure our allies, but it also will help in terms of escalation management, which is one of the few things that we know that this administration is interested in when it comes to a nuclear posture. But also just kind of that diversification gives the president a lot more options in terms of nuclear signaling. So, if the U.S. does build up, it's not to say we're not talking about orders of magnitude and some huge change. But in the article, I go through 4 different options for how the U.S. might build up.
There is
uploading. Yeah. And so option one is to upload. And this would be just put more warheads onto existing platforms. And supposedly this can be done relatively quickly and would increase the size of the arsenal. Option two is to expand procurement of forward deployed in theater systems. That's kind of what I was saying just now about diversifying more things that are theater range. And giving you some more options in terms of the escalation management and signaling. Option three would be to change our plans for nuclear modernization. So our nuclear modernization plan in nuclear wonk terms is referred to as the program of record, and it is pretty set in stone. It's really hard to imagine changing it, popping it open, and cutting anything at all. And that is mainly for congressional political reasons. But maybe you can expand on some of the things that are in there. For example, the B-21, the bomber leg of the triad that's being modernized, will have supposedly is going to have a lot of flexibility, and that the modernization and production of that is going relatively well compared to the other sides of things. So that's another option. The fourth option is to try to solve this strategic problem with non-nuclear capabilities. So there is an argument out there, well, if you want to deter Russia and China simultaneously, if you want to respond to their buildups, you don't have to respond in kind. You don't have to pursue additional nuclear capabilities. This option, I think this is the least strong option. You know, Russia and China clearly value nuclear signaling. They are telling us that pretty explicitly.
They're signaling right now, that's for sure.
Russia has been signaling since the start of the war in Ukraine about how it thinks of nuclear weapons. But the other reason, which is getting a lot of attention in the press lately, is because of our allies and for extended nuclear deterrence reasons. So if we say, well, do you know what? We're going to respond to this strategic moment with a conventional answer rather than a nuclear answer, our allies are going to see that and be like, no, we wanted a nuclear answer.
That's not what we asked for.
We're the ones. Yeah. It's like, we're the ones who are really up against these rising, China's a rising power to some extent. And so if we don't effectively and credibly assure our allies, we risk our allies developing independent nuclear programs. And, I don't think a more proliferated world is a safer world by any means. But so those are the four options for how the U.S. might respond to this moment. Again, I think that more theater-based capabilities is probably the best option.
Okay, so that was kind of one thing I was going to ask you is which one do you think is the best option, which you just touched on. Where do you have any indications of where you think the U.S. may go with those options? Do they agree with Heather Williams, or are they're gonna do their own thing in a foolhardy manner?
I wish that they agreed with Heather Williams on many things. The answer is I don't know. This administration has been really quiet on nuclear issues, and people might find that hard to believe because it seems like nukes have been in the news a lot. The president posted about returning to nuclear testing, Midnight Hammer, big nuclear news. But in terms of how this administration thinks about the role of nuclear weapons, we actually don't know a lot. There was the National Defense Strategy that came out earlier this year. And normally when that document comes out, it is paired with a nuclear posture review. And the nuclear posture review will tell us things like, what are the objectives of the nuclear arsenal? What type of an arsenal do we want? What's our declaratory policy? What are our negative security assurances? We didn't get any of that. There was very little mention of nuclear weapons in that document. So there's still a lot we just really don't know. Some of the things we do know in recent weeks, in the past month, senior administration officials have come out and said that we will continue to provide an extended nuclear deterrent to our allies. Now, that was a really big deal because up until then, it hadn't been made explicit. And that will have implications for the force posture and which of these options they go with. But no, I don't know what direction of travel they're going in on this or many other nuclear things.
But that's an interesting indicator you just said, because I hadn't heard that. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about the relative, low amount of reference to the nuclear enterprise in both the NSS and then in the NDS. So it's good to see something at least, but I guess there's more to be developed. And We'll see as that goes forward, right? In the so the three truths. I mean, the last truth that we're going to talk about, we can use it to kind of hop into another kind of concept here, is how the U.S. can lead a new era of arms control. And I think that transitions to a question which you talk about later in the article, which are the three simultaneous and, as you described, potentially very challenging priorities for the U.S. If it wants to lead in this new era. Can you describe those priorities? Again, these are not either, or these are three that you say need to happen kind of at the same time, right? And so what are they and what makes them so challenging?
Yeah, so the top priority, according to the Trump administration, which they have actually been quite consistent about, is that China has to be part of any future arms control agreements. And I really want to stress this point, because the little that the president has said about nuclear weapons, he always includes China. So a lot of people get excited. The president said he wants denuclearization. He's talked about denuclearization many times, but he always says he wants it with Russia and China. It isn't just another bilateral agreement that is really what he seems interested in here. So bringing China to the table is the first thing that the administration is signaling they really want. It is worth noting, China has consistently refused to participate in anything like these types of arms control agreements that we have been doing with Russia. The Chinese did have one dialogue with the State Department in the Biden administration about potential arms control, but not a ton came out of that. So that's the first issue, is how do you get China to the table?
But on that first issue too, you talk about, you talk about, and maybe you're going to, if I interrupt you, I apologize, but I found it interesting that, maybe Trump himself leading tripolar talks would then pull China on to the table, because in that case, President Xi may be interested when it's actually the heads of state discussing this.
Exactly. That's what I think is the most likely option for trilateral arms control. And the narrative and the process around this would be really important. But if Trump puts out an offer to meet with Putin and Xi to talk about the risks of nuclear weapons use, it's kind of hard to say no. Like, if you're the one who says no, it's quite clear who's left holding the bag on this issue. But there is historical precedent for this sort of thing. One of the recommendations that I made was to go back to the 1973, I think it's called the Agreement on the Prevention of Nuclear War, and that accompanied other arms control efforts, but it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's nothing fancy. It's just coming to an understanding of, we recognize that the risks of nuclear use are rising. We also recognize that we are in a strategic competition with each other. There's no point in pretending that we're not, but we also want to recognize the following steps that we will take to prevent nuclear use. And, Trump seems to really like personalist politics. He likes leading a lot of these initiatives himself. He wants to get a good deal out of it. If that's the case, then, I think this might be a window of opportunity to try to have a trilateral summit on nuclear issues. And to be clear, that would be a really big deal. There's never been anything like that before. And so even if the outcome, we're not going to get a new version of New START coming out of something like that, but that's okay. Because right now it's just about how do you get the Chinese to the table, I think.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's great. And we'll see. It does, you're right. It does fit into his mindset, being there, making the deal, being personally involved in that, and doing something that maybe hasn't been done before. I think these are all things that would strike a chord with President Trump. So in that case, we'll see. The U.S. government may take Heather Williams' advice seriously in that case, which would be good. So that was one priority. What are the other two priorities that you talked about in the article?
Yeah, so other priorities are getting non-strategic nuclear weapons involved. And, I kind of gave a preview of this at the beginning, and you referred to the chart that we have in the piece. But this is where Russia and China have just really sprinted ahead of the U.S. So in terms of active non-strategic nuclear systems, also some people refer to these as tactical nuclear weapons. just to avoid confusion. Russia has increased the types that it has by 25%. China has gone from having 1 to 3 types of these platforms, whereas the US has decreased by 33%. So this is somewhere where we have a really big gap, but also I think this gets forgotten a lot, but when New START was negotiated and when it went through the Senate for advice and consent to ratification, the Senate mandated that the next agreement has to deal with tactical nuclear weapons. And so there's a legacy to try to incorporate this issue into the follow-on. Russia has pretty consistently rejected this. There's some questions about whether or not the Brits or the French might have to get involved, and I'm sure we'll talk about Macron's speech in a little bit. But then, the other factor in all of this is the NPT, and this is the 1968 Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, and it meets every 5 years to have a review of where it's at, and its review conference is coming up next month in April. There is a lot of pressure on this review conference. And so another priority for the administration has to be, we have to do something. We have to bring something to this, to the NPT to show that we are trying to make progress on arms control, on risk reduction measures. Whether or not that can happen in the next month, I don't know. But just to kind of finish telling the big story and putting everything into this context, it isn't just about the geostrategic competition. It is also about the concurrent and parallel diplomatic pressure that I don't know how much this administration cares about those things. Our allies and partners really care about it. The Brits in particular are really eager to deliver something to the nuclear diplomatic community. So that's kind of the different pressure points and the big picture story about the end of arms control and what might come next for the U.S. at least.
That you talk as well in that you say that one thing the U.S. needs is people with new thinking to seize opportunities when they arise, new creativities, still maintaining lessons learned, but looking forward in the future. What does this new thinking look like? Here at the University of South Florida Global National Security Institute, we do work with a future strategist program, and it's students looking to create the next generation of national security leaders. Some of them will be at the conference we're going to have in a few weeks. And, what should those students hear about what this new thinking looks like if they want to be part of the conversation in the future?
I really appreciate you calling this out, because I will issue a call to all of those students, all of you future leaders. This is your moment. Because when we think about what is the future of arms control, this is probably a controversial statement, but I'll go with it. To some extent, you have a blank slate. It can look like whatever the world needs it to look like. Now, I want to stress, let's not just come up with arms control agreements for the sake of doing something. I don't think anyone is advocating for that. But I think the starting point has to be, what is the new geostrategic reality? And a lot of us are still coming to terms with that. In DC, old thinking dies slowly often, and the world is very, very different. So taking a step back and saying, okay, what does the world look like? Where are the biggest risks? And arms control was never about reductions. Arms control does not equate to, oh, you cut this many and we cut that many. Arms control is about management. It's about how do you manage competition so that the worst things don't happen. And when it comes to nuclear weapons, they're pretty horrible things that we're talking about could happen. And so, if you look at the history, don't get me wrong, there are incredible lessons learned to draw from START, SALT, Moscow Treaty, New START. Even if you look to things like the Biological Weapons Convention, Chemical Weapons Convention, Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, there's this really rich history of arms control. And we do need to harvest from that to realize, okay, how do you tie this agreement and this management tool to the moment, to what is needed? But in terms of what that looks like in the current moment, I really think that I would love to learn from early career folks in the field who do take a blank slate approach to this and think about it a bit differently. Just one last point on this. A lot of us who work on arms control issues, we are still relying on a book that was written in 1960. Right. So Schelling and Halperin, Strategy in Arms Control. I'm looking at it on my bookshelf right now. Every one of us has a copy and all of us keep going back to it. And I'm as guilty of this as anybody and saying, well, Schelling and Halperin said A, B, C. It's a great book, but maybe this moment calls for something other than a book written by two guys based on a Harvard seminar in 1960. And I don't, I feel blasphemous saying anything bad. And so this is not a criticism of the book. Rather, it is saying we need additional thinking on top of that book.
That's a really great answer. And it's one of those, sometimes I'll ask questions and I'm like, hopefully it's a good question. I'm really glad I asked that question because, and just the way you started out saying, this is your moment. We may use that as a quote in the future because I think that's fantastic to tell our students. So we have about 70 of them here looking at different areas of being involved in national security enterprise. And, a lot of them probably... It's like nuclear is, that's what my dad or that's what my grandparents worried about. That's not what the modern world is. Well, no, not necessarily. And in fact, it needs new thinking. Again, appreciative, absorbing the lessons of the past, but still it's a different era right now. And I think that combination is really what provides some innovative solutions to some age-old problems, which are changing now. I really appreciate your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it genuinely is a moment for it. And I'm also glad you raised, this is something that we deal with a lot at PONI, the project that I run, is it's almost like people forget that nuclear weapons are still around.
You guys still talk about that? Really? Yeah, that's
I know.
Sort of thing. Yeah. Uh-huh.
They're still a thing. But yeah, there are thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons still in the world. We are very lucky that only 9 countries have nuclear weapons and not more than that. But managing the risks associated with those weapons, that is a lifelong quest. Like that is a mission that will exist as long as nuclear weapons exist. And we need the best and the brightest working on the issue to help us figure out how to reduce the risks associated with them.
General McKenzie, our executive director, he'll get asked, I've seen him get asked this sometimes, talking about the threat, not recently, but in the past, threat of Iran to the interests of the United States, the threats of, countries, Venezuela or countries in the Western Hemisphere to the interest of China, to the interest of the United States. And he'll say, look, at this point in history right now, there's only one nation that is an existential threat to the United States, and that's Russia. Because right now, Russia can pretty much destroy the United States within about an hour. There's no other nation that has that capability. So basically saying, don't forget about that threat that still exists. Don't forget about nuclear weapons. And we still have to have some solid policy and thinking that goes with that. That's why he was real big on doing this type of conference and having this conversation we're going to have in March, because it is still such a relevant conversation.
It is. And I also, something that I think that Gen Z and the next generation thinkers on this, where they can particularly help us, is, forgive the pun, but getting out of the nuclear silo. And I mean that in a few ways.
It's hard to avoid the pun, though. It sort of writes itself, right?
It does. It's also, it genuinely is the best word. But the nuclear community, we're pretty siloed. We all know each other. We all know what each other are going to say. And occasionally we have new ideas and debate them. It's really prime community for new thinking and new ideas and new blood, but also because I don't think that we can keep treating nuclear weapons as a discrete issue. Whereas it's like, for example, what's going on in Iran right now? It's like, well, there's this war going on in Iran. Oh, there's also this nuclear angle to it. It's like, no. The nuclear component is really central to the cause of the war, to what is the outcome of the war going to be. Mm-hmm. As long as Iran's stockpile is still unaccounted for, you've got a really big risk on your hands. But also that incorporating new technologies, things like space, AI, into our thinking about nuclear issues, it's going to take a new generation to really bring us forward in our thinking on that.
And a new wrinkle that is within the nuclear world is on March 2nd, and you referenced this already. French President Macron, he made this landmark speech spelling out a new doctrine of forward deterrence for France. He would increase warheads, greater cooperation with European allies, and even cease disclosures of France's nuclear arsenal. So how does this pronouncement fit into their overall trends in nuclear arms control? And what can you envision going forward as this new policy is executed?
Yeah, for anyone interested in this, I highly recommend an article by my colleague Astrid Chevroy at, it's a French last name. I'm sure I butchered it with my Boston accent, but I highly recommend her piece at CSIS. And she kind of outlines the impact of the speech, what was significant, what might be getting overblown a little bit. But I mean, main takeaways from the speech: Macron announced that they're going to increase the size of the French arsenal. They talk about the possibility of deploying nuclear capable systems to partner European countries, not permanent basing, but as a possibility. And then also some joint planning and exercising with some European partners. So I think there's a few key implications for this, including for arms control. The biggest question that I have, and I'm looking forward to discussing with our European friends and partners, what does this mean for NATO? Because there already is a nuclear planning group within NATO that France isn't part of. So the risk that I worry about with this announcement is, are we just creating two competing, potentially parallel forums for discussion of nuclear issues within the NATO alliance? And, the French have offered assurances that's not what this is. But I think as this issue develops, that's probably the number one thing that I'm going to be watching for. But in terms of arms control, this, I don't think the French want to hear this, but the French announcement, along with the UK's nuclear modernization program and some changes in their posture, it could make them a really big player in arms control. Because Russia and China have often said that they won't do further arms control unless France and the UK are involved. And particularly now, if they are both expanding their arsenals, then they might have a role to play in some future agreements. Thus far, that is anathema to both London and Paris, and I'm sure that they will give me grief for saying this. But if they wanted to, they really could play either a spoiler role or a bit of a savior role in bringing in some sort of risk reduction or arms control efforts. With that said, I think that the Brits have been historically one of the world leaders in risk reduction, in dialogue, transparency. Historically, they have really popped the hood on a lot of their decision making and how they think about the role of their nuclear arsenal. And so there is a bit of a legacy there for that with them. But overall, a lot of the reporting on Macron's speech seems to be, this is in response to the Trump administration and concerns about U.S. credibility. Yeah, sure. But let's not forget the bigger driver here, which is Russia, which is repeatedly invaded a neighbor, has relied on nuclear threats throughout, has expanded its regional and dual capable nuclear platforms. So this isn't all coming from the Trump administration or even from the U.S. A lot of this is being driven by Moscow.
We'll go ahead and find that article, and we'll put a link to it in our show notes for this podcast, so that way Astrid can get properly recognized. Sorry, you talk about Russia, and actually in a separate piece by one of your CSIS colleagues said. In 2022, in the fall of 2022, when they were really threatening hard the use of nuclear weapons, that was possibly one of the most dangerous nuclear crises in decades for the United States. The nuclear rhetoric has subsided a little bit, but Russia's war aims in Ukraine certainly haven't subsided. Where do you think that's going? What lingering concerns do you have regarding Russia's nuclear capability and their continuing quest to emerge victorious in Ukraine?
My biggest concern is, what are Russia's lessons learned about the role and the value of nuclear threats? I am assuming that Russia's geopolitical ambitions will not stop with Ukraine, and whatever peace agreement happens and whatever the terms, that Russia will remain ambitious and might cause mischief for some of its neighbors, particularly non-NATO members, or non-NATO neighbors. And so what I really worry about, and it's a real shame that we can't have more transparent and regular dialogue with Russian colleagues. A lot of my Russian colleagues and friends used to be able to just hop on a call and get answers to these types of questions, and we can't really do that anymore. But if Russia's takeaway is, nuclear threats slowed Western intervention significantly, if it is that the nuclear threats bullied the U.S. out of directly getting involved at certain stages, then that means not only is this not the end of Russia's nuclear threats, but they might ramp those up. They might make those threats more aggressively and even sooner in a nuclear conflict. So, but it is interesting that the nuclear rhetoric has died down a little bit. I think I would probably argue that the rhetoric has died down, but the nuclear saber rattling hasn't died down. It's just changed. Because now we see Russia not just talking about nuclear, but using nuclear capable systems like the Oreshnik. They have done testing of, I believe it's the Burevestnik in recent months as well. And so it's gotten to a point, maybe Russia doesn't need to talk about it quite so much. They can just show it.
Yeah.
And that worries me as well, because that has escalation implications.
Yeah. Good. Well, not good, but I mean, that's it's very clarifying, because I think a lot of people, they haven't heard much, but I mean, and so they think maybe there's just not as much of a threat, but that's good to hear that and understand now it may have just evolved a little bit. So we need to be cognizant. So from the, fairly current to the hyper current, kind of as we start to wind down the interview. So we're about, at the time we're recording this, we're a little over a week into the combined U.S. and Israeli operations in Iran. Iran's nuclear capabilities were, according to various sources, anywhere from substantially degraded to obliterated in the previous Operation Midnight Hammer in June of 2025. And, U.S. and Israeli aircraft have subsequently targeted nuclear-related facilities and missile sites as well, although the results are, at this point, fairly unclear. As someone who spends a lot of time thinking about nuclear geopolitics and national deterrence strategies, how will Iran figure into your thinking going forward?
That's not the question I expected. It's a really good one, though. I think it's too soon to tell what lessons we take away from Iran. I thought Midnight Hammer, we had satellite imagery analysis showing that Midnight Hammer did inflict significant damage to the nuclear program. I don't think it obliterated it quite to the degree that some in the administration might have claimed, but there are a whole lot of degrees between status quo ante and obliteration, and it was somewhere in that space. We always knew that there was a stockpile of somewhere around 400 kilograms of 60% highly enriched uranium that is still unaccounted for. We also knew that there's a third enrichment site. And then there's also this additional site that one of my colleagues, Joseph Rogers, has been tracking called Pickaxe Mountain. There's also Iran civilian nuclear facility at Bushehr. And so those are the four key things that I am still watching in the ongoing war in Iran. It's just a few quick highlights from it. Thus far, there have not been any direct strikes, it sounds like, on the Bushehr reactor, which is a good thing because you don't really want to hit a nuclear reactor. It's also a good thing because that reactor is run jointly with the Russian state-owned energy company Rosatom. And so there are a lot of Russians there. So one of the things that I'm watching most closely has been if and how Russia gets involved. But the other piece that I am genuinely concerned about, it is the stockpile. 60% enriched. It's not quite, weapons grade is usually said to be around 90%. You can do a lot with 60% enriched uranium. How secure is that? Is it vulnerable to non-state actor threats? What are the Iranians going to do with it as the war evolves? And so to your question, how does Iran factor into my thinking about these issues? It makes me think that the non-proliferation order and the rules that we had, they failed when it comes to Iran. And we need to consider other tools for how to handle non-proliferation going forward. But this can still go sideways a whole lot of ways. And so I am not going to make any more predictions and be proven right or wrong.
Well, I mean, I think we can probably guess that there's going to be continued chaos inside Iran. And anytime you combine, at least to me, from my foxhole, combining chaos and availability of nuclear material and a latent desire for nuclear capability is probably not a good combination that we should be happy about going forward.
Probably not. It does seem like we did a lot of damage to their ability to enrich. So they probably aren't going to be trying to enrich that to 90%, especially during an ongoing war, because the centrifuges are really sensitive, especially to bombs. But nonetheless, as long as that stockpile is there, in the short term, it's a question of how vulnerable is it to theft or to leaking. Like, you don't want radioactive material being released into the atmosphere, really. But also the question of coming out of this, what will Iran's ambitions be whenever this war ends and under what conditions it ends?
Yeah.
If it is some version of the existing regime, I could imagine them wanting to get a nuclear weapon pretty fast to deter something like this from happening again. If it's a different regime, I would hope that any sort of settlement would include turning over that stockpile to the IAEA.
Yeah. We're about out of time, but I do want to ask one. I'm going to add one more question. Here's the thing. I don't know what the question is because you had it envisioned in your head and you were about to provide some fantastic insights. And now I'm going to ask the unasked question, which is just a blank silence from me so that you can answer that question that you had in your head that you thought I was going to ask and you had some insight to provide.
I thought you were going to ask how worried should we be about nuclear issues in Iran.
Okay, you answered that, please.
Yeah. No, that was the main main thing. I think, but as a closing out point, I actually want to circle back to what you flagged on opportunities for students, new leaders, and early career folks in this field. Iran is actually a perfect example. We've never been here. I was talking to a colleague today because we're doing some analysis on the Iran on the HEU stockpile in Iran, and I was like, what historical examples can we draw on? Like, literally, where is the playbook that tells us how to analyze the situation? And there really isn't anything. Like, the closest that we could come up with was the August 91 coup against Gorbachev, when there was a time when it wasn't quite clear who had control of nuclear weapons. There was concern about loose nukes in the post-Soviet era. This is totally different. Like, what do you do with HEU in a war zone? And so to just really encourage young people, like not just young people, early mid-career professionals, anybody interested in foreign policy right now, don't be intimidated by the nuclear topic. Go get smart on it. It's if you're looking for resources, check out Project on Nuclear Issues. We have a video series on Deterrence 101 and Arms Control 101 and a ton of other resources. But we just really need you, and we really need creative thinking, because as the war in Iran is showing, this issue and the nuclear weapons are not going away anytime soon.
We need those young minds. I couldn't agree with you more. Heather Williams, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you.
Special thanks to our guest today, Heather Williams, a highly acclaimed researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the author of a recent analysis on the expiration of the New START Treaty. Next week on the podcast, we'll open up the history books. Our guest will be author Matthew Miller, a senior historian and veteran. We'll talk to him about his latest book, Assault Brigade, the 18th Australian Infantry Brigade in World War II. You'll want to join us for that episode. While you're listening, right now, next week, or whenever, be sure to subscribe to ATB on your favorite podcast platform, rate, and review. We genuinely appreciate you sharing some time with us today. You can find GNSI on YouTube, LinkedIn, and X. Be sure to follow, like, and subscribe. Tell your friends and colleagues as well, and check our monthly newsletter. All this and much more on our website, usf.edu/GNSI. That's going to wrap up this episode of At the Boundary. Each new episode will feature global and national security issues we found to be insightful, intriguing, maybe controversial, but overall just worth talking about. I'm Jim Cardoso, and we'll see you at the Boundary.